The U.S.-Dakota War that took place in 1862 in the Minnesota River Valley was a catastrophic event that changed the lives of hundreds of Dakota people forever. The war was ignited when 5 white settlers were killed by Dakota warriors after the annuities promised by the U.S. government during the Treaty of Mendota came extremely late and put the Dakota on the brink of starvation. This war resulted in the permanent removal of the Dakota tribes from Minnesota land and the largest mass hanging in U.S. history of 38 Dakota men. But there were many events that led up to the war in the first place. In 1851, Dakota tribesmen ceded over 24 million acres of land to the U.S. in return for $1,665,000, which is a little more than half a cent per acre, in cash and annuities over a period of 5 years. This enormous amount of land included much of the Minnesota Territory as well as land in Ohio and the Dakotas. This land was opened to white settlers 3 years later. The Dakota were not happy with this treaty because not only did it divide the Dakota tribe into Upper and Lower Sioux, they also claimed that they were tricked into signing the papers without proper information about what was included in the clauses of the treaty. This, as well as hostilities with their new white neighbors, increased tension over the Minnesota Territory. In 1857, the Dakota tribe signed another treaty after being tempted by the thought of increased annuity payments. Although the treaty appropriated much more than the Treaty of Mendota, the Dakota were never given the full payment in annuities, and this became the cause of bitter complaint among the Dakota. All the treaties that were signed in 1851 and 1858 were designed to suffice for the Dakota as farmland, but few of these hunting tribes were willing to give up their lifestyle, and the few who did were bitterly criticized for leaving their way of life and surrendering to the white man. In the winter of 1861 and 1862, the Dakota went on the brink of starvation due to crop failure the fall before. This, paired with late arrivals of annuities, increased tension among the Dakota, especially in the young tribesmen. Many soldiers left Minnesota in early 1862 to help the U.S. during the Civil War, giving the Dakota the perfect opportunity to rebel. On July 14, 1862, Upper Sioux tribes gathered and marched to the Upper Agency, right outside of their reservation, and demanded to know why the food inside was not given to the tribes. The agent in charge was reluctant to give the food without the annuity payments, as was the tradition, but eventually was forced to give in by the impending danger of rebellion. But this was the only major event that took place, and eventually it seemed that the restlessness had died down for good. On August 14, 1862, four young Dakota warriors who were hunting came across the cabin of Mr. and Mrs. Webster, which they raided and took a few eggs from, and in the process killed 5 white settlers, including Mr. and Mrs. Webster. The Dakota, realizing the severity of the action, immediately returned to the reservation and told their town leader, Red Middle Voice, what had happened. That very night, Dakota chiefs gathered at a chief named Little Crow's house, who was widely respected by all the Dakota chiefs. At first, the older chiefs were reluctant to start a war, but in the end, the younger chiefs managed to convince them otherwise, and the next day, on August 18th, the U.S.-Dakota War began. On August 18th, the Dakota Army marched towards the Lower Agency, a settlement of trader posts, and attacked the town, killing many settlers and traders and burning down buildings built on the land. The people who survived fled towards Fort Ridgely in New Ulm via the Redwood Ferry. The commander, who was situated in Fort Ridgely by the name John S. Marsh, immediately set out to find out what had exactly happened in the Lower Agency, leaving 19-year-old Thomas P. Gare in charge of the fort. He started out for the settlement with 46 men on the same day, but was killed along with 24 men in an ambush. On August 19th, the Dakota Army gathered around Fort Ridgely to try and attack the military stronghold, but later they decided to target New Ulm instead. The Dakota were around 400 in number, but despite their populated army, they were not well prepared for the battle against artillery that took place in New Ulm. Already weakened by the months of starvation the Dakota had went through, they were no match for the shells the New Ulm soldiers had, and by nightfall they were forced to withdraw into the Lower Agency. The next day, the Dakota started a siege on Fort Ridgely, that lasted for 4 days. While the Dakota were fighting battle after battle in the Minnesota Territory, Governor Ramsey had appointed former Governor Henry H. Sibley to head an expedition to crush the rebellion. On the 26th of August, Colonel Samuel McPhail advanced with 1,400 soldiers, and on August 27th lifted the siege on Fort Ridgely. The refugees in the fort were then sent to St. Paul. Sibley arrived the next day with entire force. Chief Big Eagle, one of the leaders of the Dakota tribes who was against the rebellion, would later recall, "We thought the fort was the door to the valley, as far as St. Paul, and if we got through, nothing could stop us this side of the Mississippi." But the defenders of the fort were very brave and kept the door shut. On the other hand, in New Ulm, the Dakota attacked the settlement twice. The first time on August 23rd, killing 4 white settlers and burning a number of buildings. The next day, on August 24th, the Dakota Army fired a few long-range shots in an attempt to drive off cattle and then withdrew. This marked the end of the first part of the war. After the U.S. Army drove the Dakota men from New Ulm and Fort Ridgely, there were more expeditions to secure and release the many captives held by the Dakota, as well as capture and punish as many Dakota as possible. On September 23rd, 5 weeks after the war began, the Dakota surrendered in Camp Release, where today is Montevideo, releasing 269 total captives, most of which were women and children. Upper Sioux Chief Red Iron met Sibley as he entered and made sure that the captives were protected until they were released. Over the next few days, more and more Dakota tribesmen came and joined the truce after being forced by starvation. By October 4th, over 1,250 natives were taken into custody. The war had finally ended, but the U.S. was not done just yet. The U.S. dissolved all previous treaties between them and the Dakota, and around 1,600 combat men were put into concentration camps. The U.S. also took the land of Ho-Chuk, which was another native tribe and had no relation to the tribe, and placed them first in Dakota Territory and later in Nebraska. The trials that were held after the war were held under extremely unfair circumstances, some lasting less than 5 minutes. They were not allowed legal representation, and the U.S. treated them neither as citizens nor as a separate country. Not only that, but not many Dakota spoke English and were not given a chance to understand and defend themselves against their alleged charges. For the same reason, there were almost no witnesses from the Dakota side, and most of the trials were held the white man's word against the Dakota. On December 5th, the court finished its work, and out of 392 prisoners who were tried, 309 were sentenced to death, and 16 were sent to prison. The U.S. did not recognize the Dakota were their own nation and did not judge them accordingly, so the charge of just participating on the side of the Dakota was enough for execution. President Abraham Lincoln requested the court for the cases, and after overviewing them, decided that 38 of the 309 would be executed. But they were not allowed new fair trials and were killed on the basis of biased trials. On December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota tribesmen gathered onto the platform in Mankato and were hanged at the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. But the U.S. didn't stop there. After the execution, the entire Lower Sioux and a lot of the Upper Sioux tribes were exiled from Minnesota land, and a bounty was put on the head of any Dakota tribesman that was found on Minnesota territory. And in this way, many tribesmen oblivious to this new law were murdered. The U.S.-Dakota War, a historic event that bears witness to the resilience and strength of the Dakota tribes, continues to resonate through the annals of history. The Dakota people endured unimaginable hardships and were exiled from their cherished homeland, yet refused to succumb to despair. Today, despite multiple attempts to reappeal, the ban placed against the Dakota in Minnesota land is still in place. Although the struggle has become history for us, it continues for the Dakota till this day.